Welcome to Centered, Becoming Whole in a Chaotic World. This is a podcast about orientation, integration, and the lifelong work of becoming whole. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong, a PhD exercise physiologist with a deep interest in the intersection of the physical and the spiritual. Well, Dr. Armstrong, welcome to Centered. It's a pleasure to be here. So looking back, was there a moment when your life began to orient around what mattered most? Wow. So looking back, I'd have to say there's a lot of events in my life that have kind of kept me oriented. This whole idea of well-centered fitness approaching a asymptote or being centered around the SPIES model is really a series of events throughout our lives that cause us to reorient ourselves as we start to get fragmented, distracted, pulled away from what really matters. But I say if I have to probably pick one event that was a bit more of a keystone event in my life, I'd have to go back to the geography class I had in undergraduate school at West Virginia University, where I was asked to read and write a paper on Garrett Hardin's now famous essay from 1968, The Tragedy of the Commons. I think that particular essay and the discussion about it really framed my worldview, and that same article has continued to shape my worldview as life has gone on and as I've experienced more things. And I think probably a secondary moment would be when I was first introduced to Pierre Teilhard and his book, The Phenomenon of Man. And I think that has also shaped my thinking quite a bit more over time. What do you think is most pulling people away from a centered life right now? I think society itself is pulling people away from being centered. I mean, we're so pulled by busyness, by scrolling on our phones, social media, news that really doesn't do anything to unite us. I think even from the standpoint of church in many cases, I think tends to pull us away from being centered because it puts faith on ourselves. I think that's one of the biggest flaws in many of the Christian denominations is that they focus on personal salvation rather than collective salvation. And that tends to make us think more of ourselves and less of others, gives us a more of an us and them kind of mentality. And I think as well, we get a little bit more of that us or them mentality through political systems in this country. Being a kind of bipolar, to use probably an appropriate term, political setup here where you have only two dominant political parties. And, when you vote for somebody, you're pushed that if you vote for so-and-so, it's going to end up being a vote against somebody else. And so we end up getting politicians in office that really don't serve us, but we look at them as being the lesser of two evils, and we're okay with that. And I think that's horrible. And I think, we're being pulled apart just by the nature of the tribalism that, I guess that's part of human nature, is to collect ourselves into groups. But it tends to be pulling us apart more than it does anything to really pull us together. And so what's keeping us from being centered is we're not focused on any specific, what I would call asymptote or, point of centering in our lives. And if we don't have that point of, or that anchor in our lives, we're going to tend to be pulled away from what we really by nature should be gravitating toward. And so I think it's just that disconnectedness, that lack of an anchor, that is causing us to move away from being centered. what spiritual practices have been most formative in your life? Spiritual practices, I look at the spiritual as being bigger than self, so it's that idea that there's something greater than self. And personally, I think every practice that we do, anything that we do in our lives, should have a spiritual orientation to it. And so, yes, participation in my church is a part of my spiritual practice, but that's not the heart and soul of my spiritual practice. I think hosting this podcast is one aspect of a spiritual practice that has great formative value in my life. I think journaling on a regular basis, meditation, self-reflection, reading, these are all spiritual practices, even exercise, trying to get my body healthy and fit for not only longevity, but for a greater purpose is a spiritual practice. And so I would honestly say that, everything that I'm doing has a spiritual orientation to it, because it's all driving towards that, again, that omega point, that asymptote, that center in my life. And at the center of that life is community, unity, joy, life itself. And so, to me, everything is spiritual. And so whatever I'm doing for spiritual purposes. And so I guess it's more of having a spiritual practice of doing things with the spiritual orientation is the spiritual practice. And that doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense, but that's where I would put it at, is that, everything is spiritual, and everything that we do, if we do it with a spiritual orientation to it, is going to be formative, is going to be purposeful, big P purpose in our lives. And so, I don't know if that really answers the question well, and it's kind of interesting because I wrote the questions, but it's kind of where I'm thinking, as we begin to orient ourselves in a more transcendent self direction, as opposed to, being either totally self-centered or, overly other-centered. We want to be transcendent in it. So it's that thought that everything that we are doing is for a greater purpose, is for a united purpose, that we're all interconnected, then that makes everything that I do a formative practice in my life. So in your mind, what does modern culture misunderstand about the role of the body flourishing? Modern culture, what do they misunderstand? I think that we tend to think of the body as something distinct from the spiritual and from the other dimensions of the SPIES model. We tend to think that, we're either overly oriented towards health and physical longevity. I think longevity is getting horribly distorted in our society, that it's all about living longer without thinking about living with vitality, with purpose, and, oriented towards something greater than self. And on the other hand, I think we also don't take care of our bodies. We look at how we have science and medicine that can cure us if we don't treat our bodies well. And so we tend to think that eating healthy, eating more whole foods, a more ancestral diet, those types of things are things that we just can't do in the modern culture. That we have access to foods from all over the globe. We, are able to process foods and make foods tastier. And if we eat too much of something, we can simply just diet, or we can take medications to reverse the ill effects of those foods. And so I think what we don't understand is that the body is sacred, that the body is spiritual, that, very much like what Teilhard would write is that, we are not spirit and matter, we are spirit matter. And I think that is one of the things that the modern culture truly misunderstands. To you, what does it mean to think well in a chaotic age? To think well in a chaotic age, I think we have to be open to new ideas. I think we have to be willing to be challenged. I think the educational system in our country needs a huge overhaul. As a college professor, I get so disappointed with students that, want to just know what's going to be on the test. And I get upset with professors that, just teach to a test, or even, our K through 12 system. It's like we have this system of requirements that have been set up, and you check the boxes and you pass your way on through. And it's not about thinking more broadly, growing our intellect and our society through greater knowledge and understanding. I think part of why we are so chaotic is that we can't think beyond what is right in front of us. We have to be taught this is what it is, and then there's this, and we don't have the skill set to be able to say, but wait a minute, that's not right. That needs to change, and how do we change it? And I think that in order to think well, we have to think outside of the constraints that we are presently living in. We have to challenge everything. We can't just let ideas be fed to us and we just accept them blindly. We have to, again, challenge everything. And when we challenge everything, that's going to ease some of that chaos within the world. And we also are setting ourselves up to be more welcoming, to be more understanding, and to see other people's points, because we're willing to question that maybe our own understanding is not accurate. And truth be told, none of us have a perfect picture of everything. We don't have all knowledge. And so we have to accept, at least to a certain degree, we are wrong in every situation. So where are we wrong? How are we wrong? And how are other people right? And once we start thinking that way, I think we're going to be a much less chaotic society. We'll be much more unified. How do you cultivate emotional maturity? Well, how do I cultivate emotional maturity? I don't know that I do that very well. It's one of my biggest struggles, and it's why I think the emotional dimension is really one of the keystones of the SPIES model, because it holds everything together, and it's kind of the fruit or the outcome of centering ourselves in the other areas. And so to cultivate emotional maturity, I have to accept my limitations, accept my weaknesses, accept my failures. I have to have grace for myself and for others. I have to stay really grounded in my faith. And I think one way to kind of cultivate emotional maturity is to think of, the fruit of the Spirit that is, detailed in the Christian Bible, that we have, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Those to me are the fruit of emotional maturity, of what we're striving for with the SPIES model. And I guess the one way that I can say that I cultivate those in myself is to think of those fruit as something that need to be cultivated, and not something that is just simply a gift of the Spirit, like a lot of people are kind of taught or teach that that's the case. I think it is something that we have to work on a daily basis. We have to, till the soil, so to speak. We have to fertilize it. We have to, take out the weeds. We have to grow these things in our lives. And so cultivating emotional maturity is, in a sense, working on those areas and trying on a daily basis through journaling, through prayer, through meditation, through self-reflection, through listening to people, are the ways that we best cultivate emotional maturity. Am I doing that well? I'm not even close. And certainly ask my family, does Dr. Armstrong, or does your dad, your husband, does he have emotional maturity? They're going to laugh at you and say, seriously? So it is something that takes a lot of work. It takes cultivation. And my daily practices ideally are centered around doing what will cultivate that. And so whatever I do within that SPIES model, whatever I'm doing to orient myself spiritually, physically, intellectually, emotionally, and socially, are all working to bring together and cultivate that emotional maturity. In your opinion, what does real community require? Real community requires grace, empathy, understanding. It requires that we understand that we are not the center of the universe. Our group is not the center of the universe. Community is greater than self. It's greater than our tribal groups. To me, it is the asymptote. It's the omega point of Teilhard's spiritual evolution. It is what we as a human species should be and are evolving toward. It's going to require, in order to grow, we need to have challenges to the system. Evolution, physical, spiritual growth all require that there be tension on the system. And we have to be challenged. And I think right now, in this chaotic world that we're in, there's quite a bit of stress, tension, and fuel for growth. And I'm very optimistic that that tension is going to lead to something greater. And so, again, without tension, without that stress, there's no growth. And so real community is going to require a certain degree of tension, and it's going to require a certain degree of openness to changing ourselves and changing our systems. And so real community is going to require that we become more spiritual from the standpoint of recognizing that there is something greater than self, and that we individually contribute to a much greater purpose, and that everybody contributes to that. And so when we recognize that our interactions with other people are purposeful, they are giving us opportunities for growth, then we can come together as a community much more effectively. And I think, for real community to develop, we have to let go of ourselves. We have to transcend self and understand the bigger P purpose. At the deepest level, what do you believe human flourishing actually requires? Well, I think, human flourishing requires what I've actually been talking about, is, again, that we transcend self, and that we understand that our growth is all orienting towards something greater, toward a greater unity, greater community, greater love. And as I mentioned in a recent episode of this podcast, the point of the SPIES model is love. And at the deepest level, I believe that for the human species to flourish, we have to evolve toward what Teilhard would call the omega point, that we have to be oriented away from self. Doesn't mean we become selfless. We need to, again, the best terminology I have for it is transcendent self, because the transcendent self is both selfish from the standpoint of self-preservation, self-care, self-growth, but it's also other-centered. It's selfless, but not selfless to the point where it becomes, in just in just a poor servitude towards others, where we're not doing it purposefully. We're doing it because we feel forced to do things. And the transcendent self is that third self that, is my God is first, my family and friends are second, and I am third. It is oriented towards an understanding that we are all unified together. We're growing more unified, and we have a role in that purpose and that greater connection and in that community. And everybody has a role in that. And we can understand that people who maybe have done us wrong in the past didn't do it purposefully. I think we have to accept that people do the best that they can do. When we are hurt, we have to look not at revenge or how to blame somebody for our circumstances, but rather how have our circumstances brought us to a point where we are now better prepared to move society forward. What daily or weekly practices help keep you centered? I would say that the biggest daily practice that keeps me centered is journaling. Being centered on what is my spiritual goal for today, physical goal, intellectual goal, emotional goal, social goal, and reflecting on my day, what I need to do, trying to start my day with a more positive attitude, and reading, orienting myself toward the center. So trying more and more to understand that is keeping me more centered. So, journaling, reading, reflection, exercise, eating a healthy diet, having time with my family and friends. One practice that we try and do in our household is what I call a 15-minute check-in, that nearly every evening we try and kind of sit down for ideally 15 minutes. It usually goes longer than that, but we sit down and just talk about the day, try and interact and just kind of catch up, because we can get so busy and going in so many different directions that if we don't take that time, we become much more disconnected. Trying to do things that are pointing me towards the center is really the practices that help me keep the most centered. And again, I don't do any of this perfectly. This is think of it as kind of a growth of consciousness mindset, that I'm becoming more and more conscious of what I need to change and how far I am from centered. I think the closer that I grow toward the center, the more I realize how distant I am from it. And so how do I draw myself closer to that? And how do I pull people with me to that center? Those are the types of practices. So I'd say probably the most important daily practice for me is just taking time to sit down and mindfully reflect on how my life is going and how am I oriented towards the center. What warning signs tell you you are becoming fragmented? Wow, warning signs. I would have to probably look more toward the signs that I'm actually not fragmented than looking at signs that I am fragmented, because I'm much more fragmented than I am oriented appropriately or having it all together. And so, I don't know that I have to look for warning signs. I feel like I just have to look for the ways that I can become less fragmented. because I know I'm fragmented and there's no really warning signs. If I'm going to say particular warning signs or when I might be particularly more fragmented than other times would be how I interact with other people, the language that I use, how much am I cursing, how much am I, yelling at people or under my own breath, how frustrated do I get driving, those types of things. And so I think personally for me, it's looking for the signs that I'm less fragmented and welcoming those rather than having warning signs that saying I'm becoming fragmented. I think I'm fragmented. We're all fragmented, and there's fewer warning signs. It's more looking at the signs that, okay, things are getting better. You're doing better today than you did yesterday. Do you believe human life is moving toward something? And if so, what? Do I believe human life is moving towards something? Absolutely. And to me, that something that we are moving to can have many names. I think, the simplest name, if you follow Teilhard, it is the omega point. I think a common term that we could all understand and accept is love. And I'm wanting to capitalize love, use those small caps, just like I've started to write God in this way, like it's written in the Old Testament, because it's something far greater than this simple terminology that we give for love. It is the ultimate love that we are going toward, that community, that unity. I would dare call it God. From my Christian faith, I would say that it is the example of Christ. That is that, so when we talk about as Christians that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the light, we're talking about that he has shown us the path to that orientation, toward the center, toward love, toward the omega point. And so, yes, I think we are heading towards something. I believe that we are undergoing a spiritual evolution. I feel that, we had our biological evolution. Man's not going to be changing much in the way physically, but spiritually, we have come a long way as we've grown in consciousness, but we also have a long way to go. And so I think we're moving toward a higher level of human being, of human species. And I'm looking forward to it. And I hope that we actually make it there. I know it's not an absolute, but I do believe it's something that we can all work toward. And if we work toward it, then collectively, yes, we will get there. What belief must people let go of in order to flourish? In order to flourish, I think the greatest thing that people have to believe is that they are not the center of the universe and that there is something greater than self. And if we can recognize that, then we can flourish individually. We can flourish as a human species. I like to end every conversation with the same question. If someone listening right now feels scattered, fragmented, what is one step they could take this week to begin becoming more centered? So I think most of us feel scattered and fragmented right now, particularly in the global society. I mean, I can't imagine that there's anywhere in the world where people are not feeling fragmented right now. We, in the United States, I think are particularly being hit hard with it. And I think one step that we can take this week to begin becoming more centered is to take a look inward. Sit down, take one day a week, take all 7 days. In the morning, just sit down, pull out a pad and paper, write down your thoughts, write down a goal for each of the 5 dimensions of the SPIES model: spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social. And what is just one thing that I can do in each of those areas to move toward a more centered orientation? And just taking that step of journaling on a daily basis is the first step. And from there, then we can look at further ways to grow, further activities that we can do to orient ourselves. But I think that the best thing that we can start with, the first simple baby step, is to sit down and take 5-10 minutes, or longer if you can, and just self-reflect and set some goals for becoming centered today. Thank you for listening to Centered. Please like, follow, and share with someone who can benefit. And if you'd like to support the show financially, you'll find a tip jar in the show notes.